You know how us as a collective society become completely desensitized to a word after it is regurgitated from people that don't particularly know the meaning? Unfortunately, that term has happened with industry plant. And I wanted to go into the industry plant discussion from a metal perspective and talk about some of the reasons that I feel like you do not hear this term tossed around nearly as much in the metal ethosphere as you do things like pop and hip hop. The general definition of it is extremely unclear and very broad. It has multiple different sort of branches on the same tree, but in the layman's terms definition of it, it basically comes down to an artist or a band that is manufactured most notably from a specific music company or someone that is trying to push them in a certain direction to fit a certain criteria. Most of the time what this comes down to is identifying certain trends and manufacturing an artist or a band that fits all of the hallmarks of said trend to not only market that artist or band, but to capitalize on them to try to make as much monetary gain as they possibly can. You see this tossed around a lot with a lot of pop artists where when something is popular, you'll suddenly see a lot of these mini-me artists, pretty much one-hit wonders, blow up and then fall off the face of the earth from these big labels that put a bunch of money into them. These aren't grassroots artists that are just coming up and trying their best to make it in the music industry. This also happens in the K-pop industry, where you can see so much corruption and backdoor scheming and all sorts of pyramid schemes and these weird manufacturing processes to try to make these bands that sort of fit exactly what they think that most of the time Western audiences want. You can see this happen in hip-hop a lot, where big labels will sign these mini-me rappers that pretty much mimic and parrot the exact style of more popular rappers, not even having necessarily their own style, and pretty much coming up to scratch a certain itch for an artist, especially in their absence, if they're either not making music anymore or are making music more sporadically. And considering in the modern age, streams are the name of the game, and you just want to have as many streams as possible to get those numbers up, it's very easy to see why some of these hip-hop artists that pop up and are built around the single on things like Apple Music and Spotify and things of that nature, they are made to try to have very large numbers, because it's no longer about necessarily going and selling concerts or going and selling your CD. It's about the singles, and if you're selling millions of copies of your single, or you have millions of streams, tens of millions of streams, hundreds of millions of streams on multiple songs that you churn out to fit a certain need, well, it's pretty easy to see why a bunch of executives would sit around a round table and pretty much decide that, yeah, this probably is what we need to push. You don't usually see this talked about in the metal veneer, though. One of the biggest cases that I personally have seen, and that is probably the most popular for the metal sphere, would be the Japanese band Babymetal, who have been accused in a lot of ways, somehow miraculously sprouting up during a time where there was a massive wave of Western intrigue when it came to Eastern entertainment from Japan, from China, from Korea, and aesthetically, musically, vocally, the gimmick of it really appealed to a lot of people. But let's be honest here. If you look in a vacuum at these things, most bands, most artists in one form or another, whether they're rock, metal, or otherwise, are going to be pushed in a certain direction. And you can draw the line at where you would consider being manufactured, but it might be a tough pill to swallow, but you kind of have to swallow the fact that if you like an artist, if you like a band, and they're signed to a large label, chances are that label has had a pretty big impact on their music and how they write it. These labels are not labels for no reason, and I'm not talking about your everyday underground label that has 50 black metal bands signed to it that maybe sell 1,000 copies per 3 months. I'm talking about big record labels. I'm talking about Profound Lore, Season of Mist, Metal Blade, Roadrunner, Relapse, these massive labels that have just tons and tons of sales and the biggest names in the field. I think, yeah, when you look at it in a vacuum, it's easy to say, oh yeah, wow, these bands, these artists are getting manufactured, oh, the Billie Eilishes and the Ice Spices and all of these artists, and obviously you can say that about those artists, but you have to understand that if you are being pushed by a label, that label has had a hand in it. And don't take my word for it. For decades now, in every single niche imaginable, whether it be country music, rock, metal, pop, hip hop, it doesn't matter. You have seen so many documentaries and stories of these artists and bands talking about how toxic the music industry is, how the standards are very corrupt, how the upper workings of it are very corrupt, and how you get pushed in a direction to sort of desensitize yourself and take away the creativity from your own music to try to fit a certain narrative that they're wanting to push. And I'm not talking a narrative as in like lyrics, I'm talking about the way that you sound, the way that you look, the way that you perform, fitting a certain look for your niche that is financially viable in the eyes of the people that are signing you. And obviously this isn't going to be the type of thing that they talk about immediately when you go into like non-disclosure agreements and things of that nature, but you can see so many artists coming forward about it post them leaving labels or post them making music actively anymore, and it's a very rampant thing that is really sad to see. But now on to my next point. I think the reason you don't hear about these terms thrown around as much with like rock and metal artists is because most rock and metal artists tend to be a lot more grassroots, especially if they're not signed to a larger label, and even then the creative liberties that are given to these bands are usually better than you would see from like a pop or a hip-hop mainstream artist. But the one good thing about the modern internet age, if you can give it one good thing, is the fact that fortunately you see a lot of these alternative platforms coming around and alternative ways of putting your music out there. And some of the largest artists and the ones that blow up in the modern sphere, even if they later get signed to a large record deal, you usually will see them getting a lot of support just releasing their shit independently. Platforms like YouTube and Spotify, places like DistroKid and Amuse, as well as Bandcamp, have made it very accessible for people to not only find music, but to publish their music. And obviously, monetarily, these bands and artists may not be able to make a living off of it, but it can set the framework to where when they finally do get put on to a big record deal or are approached by a major label, they have the makings of an artist that can stand their ground and sort of stick with their ideals of the type of music that they personally want to make. But it's a really interesting gray area to look at this argument of like, who is an industry plant, who isn't, and why do we really say these things to begin with? Because in a way, most mainstream artists, even in metal and rock, are manufactured to some degree. I even know that when Linkin Park first burst on the scene, if I remember correctly, I saw a story where Warner were pushing them to be a certain look when the rap metal and nu metal craze was happening. Are we automatically going to write off Linkin Park, one of the biggest, most influential, most popular bands in all of metal or rock, off solely because Warner were pushing them in a specific direction? No. Most bands in one form or another are pushed in a certain direction for money. Now we could get into a whole different discussion if we're talking about bands that have certain loans or certain tip-off things, because that is another form that the industry plant accusation can come from. And if anything, that was the initial thing that got a lot of people talking about the industry plant term, is when someone would have the big backing straight off the bat before they even made a single song, and when they would get pushed by advertisers or a label after just bursting on the scene suddenly, and they would fit a certain trend or a certain look, and they'd come out of nowhere and be pushed by these major labels or by advertisers, and you'd start seeing them everywhere. Now I think that is a whole different discussion, and that is something that I think is more worthy to look at than the former, because unfortunately there are genuinely cases of that where you will see a label or an advertiser or just a group of people push a certain artist or push a certain band that suddenly comes out of nowhere, and you've never heard of them, you've never seen them in your life before, but suddenly they have these massive videos that have amazing graphics and amazing video editing and all this pushing, and they're suddenly getting hundreds and thousands of views, and overnight they're a sensation. And most of the time, but not always, they fall off because they don't actually have the creativity to back it up. They are just being pushed because they fit a certain trend. This happened a lot in like the 90s and 2000s, where you'd see all these one-hit wonder boy bands trying to be the next NSYNC or New Kids on the Block or Backstreet Boys. It just doesn't work out. You have to have some talent to begin with, or you're just not going to cut it. But overall, I think the things that set rock and metal apart from other genres is, number one, alternative platforms like Bandcamp being a big thing. Number two, a lot of artists and bands being very underground and very independent and grassroots in the way that they come across and produce their music. Number three, metal labels technically most of the time just giving their artists and bands much more creative liberty to make the type of music that they want and not putting so many stipulations on them. And number four, metal just not really having a consistent trend. You could say this about maybe like the metalcore scene of the 2000s or the gent scene, but no one is clamoring for a certain sound or look in metal because metal is so damn diverse. If you look at the mainstream things in like pop and hip-hop, in hip-hop you have like trap, and that's pretty straightforward. You have the drill scene, it's pretty straightforward. All of these, you have mumble rap, it's pretty straightforward. When you look at pop, it's all of the electronic dark pop artists that are blowing up, and you can see the trends in how people produce their music. People like Justin Bieber, people like Harry Styles, people like Billie Eilish, they have very specific ways of creating their music that can easily be mimicked or parroted. But when you look at metal and you look at all of the different subgenres, whether it be like black metal, death metal, grindcore, gore grind, deathcore, metalcore, gent, there are literally dozens upon dozens upon dozens of subgenres and niches. How are you really going to nail that down into a specific criteria that people have to fit? You aren't going to be able to make an industry plan or manufacture something that fits a certain style because metalheads are so diverse in the type of music that they listen to when it comes to subgenres. You aren't going to be able to please every metalhead or make millions of dollars because we all like something different. And while a lot of us do cross over into other genres, there are genuinely people that pretty much just stick with their specific subgenre. I think because of that, it's just difficult to really make an industry plan unless you're going for more of a sort of gimmick approach like a band like Babymetal, which is more of a shock and awe value and will appeal to people outside of just metalheads. I think that the best way you could make a metal or rock industry plan is if you did something that was more appealing to people outside of metal and rock. They obviously aren't an industry plant, but look at a band like Ginger or look at a band like Spirit Box. The big, takeaway from that is, oh, you have a female vocalist doing death growls and screams. That is shocking to people, and so if you were to manufacture a female-fronted metal band and really, really push it with a bunch of advertising and stuff, it'd get people talking on the internet and being like, oh my god, have you heard about this female-fronted metal band? You generate that buzz, and then people would suddenly start flocking to that genre and looking for more things like it, and that would cause other people to realize, hey, we need to make something like this, and probably try to manufacture and mimic another thing. But metal and rock just usually doesn't fuck with that, and usually isn't as apt to be industry plant driven as another thing. But overall, what are your guys' thoughts of this topic of industry plants in rock and metal? Be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying fair.